Welcome to This Week in Heresy, episode 53, Learning from History, South Africa, Ferguson, and Dialog with our guest via Skype, Reverend Wilma Jakobsen. Hey Wilma, welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Hi Gina, good to see you, good to talk to you.
Yes, definitely. Well, for people who don't know who you are, could you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Wilma Jakobsen. I am an Episcopal priest, but really an Anglican priest from South Africa. That's where I was born and bred. And long story short, came to this country to work in 2003 and landed up after about 9-10 years or so in Cupertino, where I am now, it's called the rector. I'm the rector of a church called St. Jude's Church in Cupertino, which is near De Anza College. I've been there going on 3 years or so.
So then, I've talked to you about your history and how you got to here, and I found it a very fascinating story. So if you would, could you indulge me and talk about a little bit about the history of you becoming a priest?
I could do that. Yes, it is actually quite a story. I like to remember it because it reminds me of how life doesn't always work out how you planned. And I'm not one who particularly plans life, but when I was studying, it was my intention to become a teacher and to see what life did after that. And I was a high school teacher, in fact, a science teacher. But before I went teaching, I had taken a gap year to work on a campus and work with university students. And the reason I did that was I grew up in South Africa in the 1970s. Lord have mercy, sounds like a long time ago.
Right.
Which was basically during the apartheid system during South Africa. So I grew up as a white South African within the constraints of apartheid South Africa. And it's something it's not easy to explain in some ways, but it's legalized segregation. And so anyone who ends up not being part of that system has had some kind of transformation experience. And I would say that I am grateful for my parents who were not originally South African, who taught me and my sister always that everyone's equal and the system is wrong and so on. I grew up knowing that apartheid was wrong. But I would say during my university years, I had a very, very strong experience of working with others, talking with others, and discovering in a transformational way that apartheid is nothing to do with scripture, nothing to do with the Bible, nothing to do with Christianity, which it actually professed to do, nothing to do with anything that was good, and in fact was a heresy and was evil. And I really had a very strong transformational experience around what does it mean to love one's neighbor. And there's this eye-opening moment when I realized, well, goodness me, if my neighbor happens to be a Black South African, what does loving one's Black South African neighbor mean? That means I should be working to have for them to have the same privileges as I do, which in South Africa were many, if you contrasted the life of a young white South African with Black South Africans. So that honestly led me into all sorts of things. But first and foremost, it led me also to want to be a part of helping or facilitating that same kind of transformational change in other young students. And so I took a gap year after college, between college and teaching, to work on a campus and just do an internship. And really, I think it was that year that made me realize this was something I would quite like to do, maybe in the future at some point. And so I was beholden to the government for a scholarship too. So they paid for my studies, and I would work for them for 4 years. So I just started off teaching, thinking that I would work for 4 years and then maybe go to seminary to study in some way. And that's another different long story. Part of the story, long story, right, is that. That sort of got interrupted, and I ended up leaving teaching in my third year and going to seminary in the US, which really wasn't part of the plan initially. And no one thinks of going to the US; it was expensive, but I really had nothing short of miraculous kinds of things happen where people decided they wanted to give me money to go and study because they thought this was an excellent idea. And so I landed up at Fuller Seminary, which is in Pasadena in LA, and so that's kind of how I got to Southern California. And truthfully, the funny thing is that the reason I got to Fuller is that somebody at the seminary made a mistake. I guess I hope they're not listening. But somebody made a mistake and basically gave me full financial aid for my first year, for which when I applied for it in my second year, they told me I wasn't actually eligible.
No.
So I thought, funny. And I said, well, I just had it for the last year. And they said, well, somebody made a mistake. So now when someone says, how did you get to the US or how did you get to Fuller Seminary? I say, because someone made a mistake and gave me money because, it's always about the money, as I discovered.
Right.
And so, and then I planned to come for 2 years and do an MA and then go back to South Africa. But I was always open to the idea of an MDiv because friends of mine had said, that's a really good idea. And we, I'm a lifelong Anglican, born, bred, cradle from the grave. From the cradle to the grave, it will be Anglican. And so we had not really started the debate formally around women's ordination in terms of the people I hung out with. But I had been in seminary all of 3 weeks, and my mother sent me the church newsletter that said, the then Archbishop said, it's time to think about the ordination of women. And I went, that's kind of interesting. Here I am, I've just got to the US, and I'm here at seminary, and one of my classes was actually women and men together in ministry. And I was learning really what I had always thought, that women and men belong equally in mutual relationship and mutual ministry.
Right.
And truthfully, when I had talked about this kind of thing in some circles at home, some people had called me a heretic. I'd been hauled in with my principal, my teachers at the school where I taught, because he thought I was teaching the kids wrong things, right? And so it's amazing to be in school here and in the US and discovering that, no, this is, you can have a completely valid academic viewpoint that supports that, because I had thought that, but thought I was kind of on the fringe. And so it was just interesting that here we go, 3 weeks into my entire time at seminary, this comes up. And so I said, oh, that's interesting, but we don't have women deacons or priests, I'm from South Africa. And I guess I met a lot of women at seminary who were Episcopalian and planning to be ordained. And then I started attending for my second Sunday a church called All Saints Church in Pasadena, which was around the block. And there were 2 women priests at the church. And I'd never met a woman priest. This was an entirely new thing. And I have to say they were both incredibly inspiring. One of them had been a nun, and she did ministry on Skid Row in LA.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other one did pastoral work, youth work, and so on. And I could follow her around, and became friends with her, and I was in a group with her. And she really inspired me. And so, truthfully, it was like this thing that happened out of randomly. One Sunday morning, I sat in the pew waiting for church to start. And I had this thought as clear as a bell. If Franny can do this, her name was Franny. If Franny can do this, why can't I? And I was like, where did that come from? That's kind of weird. And I said, okay, but I stopped thinking that, and then realized you can't really unthink a thought. So I decided to be open to exploring. And so I guess in the next months, I was open to exploring. And then, things just continued to happen. I think a few months later, Desmond Tutu got elected Archbishop of Southern Africa, which was a turning point in South Africa. This was 1986 now. Right. So this was in the really, really bad days of the state of emergency of South Africa, when friends of mine were being detained or lived on the run, and people in general were being detained, a state of emergency, and so on. And really because of geography, Archbishop Tutu became my bishop. In our structure, you need to have your bishop's permission to pretty much do anything. So I knew I needed his permission if I was going to even think about this. And so it wasn't as clear to me that he supported it. So I knew I had to somehow get a meeting with him. So again, things sort of fell into place. I had to go home. I hadn't been home in 2 years. So I wanted to go home for the summer. And so I did an informal, which would now be a GoFundMe thing, just a sort of a whip round. A friend of mine said, write to us, we'll give you money. And so friends of mine contributed and got me a plane ticket. And I went home for the summer. And in the last week of my time there, he was consecrated as Archbishop. And it was a bit depressing because my priest had said, oh, you'll never find him. He's too busy. He won't have time to meet with you. And then another friend said, well, I'm helping to organize his celebration in the stadium afterwards. I'm going to meet with him, write him a letter, and I'll give it to him. So I did that. I wrote him a letter, gave it to my friend James, who gave it to him. And then I heard nothing. And then literally the week before, I got, you're going to laugh at this, I got a telegram. I don't even know what a telegram is. I got a telegram.
Wow.
To say, please come to a meeting at Bishop's Court next Friday. and here are 2 tickets for the enthronement, which were like gold dust. And
Oh my goodness.
to ask for a couple of tickets. So I got to go to the enthronement of the friend, and then I got to see the Archbishop on day 5 after he was consecrated.
Wow.
Which I don't think happens, right?
No, not real.
High up types. And so, of course, I sort of toddled along to Bishop's Court where his office was. And then I went and sat with him. I said a little prayer, and I thought, how do you start? But having later worked for him, I realized I found out he sometimes knew what people wanted. And so he said to me, I suppose you want to know what I think about women priests. And so I, of course, stutter, feeling very inarticulate, yes, So basically he told me he was very supportive and that the church was not at the point that it had voted in favor of this, but he personally was supportive and the church needed to facilitate and support my discernment. And so he said to me, because what had happened was the church had decided by this point to ordain women as deacons. In my second year, this had happened. And so they had sort of taken the first step, but they had not voted for women as priests. So he said to me, the church can ordain you as a deacon, but not as a priest until the whole church decides. So I said, okay. And he said, go back to the States, go do your 3rd year of study. Because by that stage, I had also decided that I needed to do the MDiv. Mm-hmm. And so I was planning to do that. And so he said, then come back and we'll see what happens next. So then I had a friend who was working as his chaplain. I went back to the US and I just wasn't that sure, I thought, when I came to the US, I was dead sure, just do or die, go and study in the US or die. So I kind of went, I'll go.
Right.
And I wasn't so sure about this. So I sort of threw it all up in the air again. And I just, prayed and threw it up almost like you send balloons up into the sky. It's like, okay, I don't know about this, but wherever the balloons land, then at least I'll know. I'll know yes or I'll know no. So I decided to do that. And then my friend who was his chaplain called me and said, he's written a letter to you. You'll get the letter. It'll tell you what's going to happen. And I said, tell me. He said, no. And here's the joke. Never got the letter. Okay.
Oh,
so
no.
This is talking probably October, the fall of my 3rd year. Didn't get the letter. Maybe November, And so I went through November, December, January, and February, didn't get the letter. And I said to them, maybe you should send a copy. I think this letter must be lost. Because letters take a long time, but not 3 months.
Right.
So then I went on a retreat because I had been saying to go on a quiet retreat. I'd gone on a retreat, and out of that, it got into spiritual direction with a Roman Catholic nun who was fabulous. I went to downtown LA each Friday, and one Friday she said to me, tell me you're Desmond Tutu, and tell me why you want to be ordained. So I think I said something like, I think this is the only way I'm going to be happy and fulfilled. And she laughed at me and she threw her hands down on the table along with a photo of him and said, you've just answered the if question. We used to talk about the if question and the when question. And she said to me, you just named it. You just your eyes lit up, the energy changed, and you actually named that this is what you should be doing. And I realized later what she said was, when you name something, there's power in it. Yep. It's like I had never verbally said, I want to do this, I should do this. I'd always said, maybe I could do this, or maybe I should do this. I'm exploring. I never really committed. But somehow in naming it, I committed, verbally at least. And something shifted. And she was right, and I had that sense in the next day that I'd crossed over a threshold. And I had somehow stepped over some kind of door, and it wasn't about if anymore. I knew the if question was yes. Mm-hmm. The question then was when. And we didn't know that because the church hadn't decided. And so I lived in that. And then I have to say my joy quotient just hit the roof. The next day I leapt around and danced around, and I was so really happy. And the next weekend, I think, it was the end of Lent. And so I went out to the Nevada desert to do a protest that they did weekly. They still do, actually, at the weapons testing place. Right. And it was the Franciscans, right? And I went with a group of All Saints, and I had a very, very moving experience. And when we went up on the Friday, and just very moving. It was partly because it was so nonviolent in contrast to everything that was happening in South Africa. Because by now it was, 1987. Right. Really, really bad times.
Yeah, I remember that.
And at one point they said, put a stone in your pocket and just walk with it. And I had that. And there was this moment when whatever was happening with the text was a moment when somebody maybe threw a glass of water at the cross as a kind of symbol of when Jesus said he was thirsty. they threw a glass of water at it. And I had this moment when I was angry, and I thought I could pick up this stone in my pocket and throw it. And it was this huge moment when I realized, I'm just like anybody else. I could be violent. Mm-hmm. I have the capacity. I have the capacity to be violent. I'm no like high and mighty person. And it was like when I went in my retreat and I thought about being a priest. I went, how can I be a priest? I don't have the inner capacity, right? People come to you for wisdom. They come to you for prayer. They come to you. And I thought, my inner life, I don't know that I have that. And so I'd gone to the nun and said, teach me to pray. Teach me to pray more deeply. And she really had helped me and done some exercises, but I really had worked on my spirituality and deepening my spirituality. And I think for me, those two pieces, deepening my spirituality and my inner process, right? And also realizing I'm like anyone else. Mm-hmm. Priest, being clergy, and it doesn't set you apart anyway. You are as human. And I had the capacity to be violent if the right circumstances prevailed, except for grace. Except for grace. And I don't know, something just, again, sort of moved in me deeply. And literally, that was the Friday. On the Saturday, I got the copy of the letter from Bishop's Court, the Archbishop. And on the Monday, 2 days later, I got the original letter. They all sort of came in, right? And in between was Easter Sunday. It was actually, it was Good Friday. Basically, it was Good Friday. It was Saturday, I got the letter. It was Easter Sunday. And it was Monday, I got the original letter. All saying the same thing. Basically, we want you to do your discernment. We want you to come back and to go through a little bit of your vocational testing here. We'll send you to seminary and we'll ordain you next year.
Wow.
I know. And I was
That's
like,
amazing.
Really? And I realized if I had got that letter when it was posted, I wasn't ready. There was no way I was interiorly ready. Mm-hmm. I wasn't ready. I couldn't have heard it. I would have been freaked out. Right. But instead, I didn't get the letter. And I went through this inner process, by which time I received the actual letter saying, we will ordain you, get through this. I was ready. I had gone through the inner process. So it was like the external confirming the internal. Mm-hmm. It's really, really interesting. And it was strong. And I realized in the years that followed, it needed to be strong. I needed to have a really strong experience of all of this because it was going to be tough, right? Because we didn't really have any. We had maybe 4 women before I came in. So then it I was 6 weeks to graduation. And I was like, oh my gosh, and I knew what I was doing. I was going home, which I did. And they changed the dates of the vocational testing to accommodate my schedule, which is interesting.
Wow. And
I went to that. It was a day-long thing. And then I went to that. And then I went to seminary for 6 months in Grahamstown in South Africa. And I got ordained the following June. And I got sent to Black Township in 1988, which was, the height of the last fair days, which was interesting and challenging too.
I bet.
So it was amazing. It was just those years, I call them the incredible years. They were pretty tumultuous, but that was a very strong experience of call. And then I ended up being the only woman deacon and then priest in my deacon in my diocese for 2.5 years till I had a companion who joined me from the seminary. Mm-hmm. So there was fun sometimes and difficult other times.
Right.
It was I had quite the life. I'll just say that. I had quite the life.
Well, it's really amazing. And like I said, I just found it quite amazing when you talk about it. And I've studied a lot about South Africa because it was one thing growing up that really pushed my heart in a way to look at the world in a different way and to realize that it made me see the world outside myself when I was younger. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of, and I've read Nelson Mandela's autobiography and all of that. And like I said, it was like the first real thing that my heart wrapped around about compassion that really made me look outside of my own self and my own country. And it made me really realize, and to the value that I still have today, that, like you said, we're all people and we're all, we all have our struggles. We all, we're all just people in this world trying to figure it out. And that we're not that different from each other. Mm-hmm. We may have some beliefs differences. We may have theology differences. We may have other differences. But when it comes right down to it, we all put pants on. We all have to go to the bathroom. We all have to brush our hair or cut our hair or put on some clothes or, and eat and all of that. Mm-hmm.
And we all need grace in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that really strikes me, and I've been thinking a lot about the apartheid years in South Africa lately because of a lot of the Black Lives Matter stuff that's been happening in the US. And
yep.
So, and I was curious to know, what are your thoughts on what's happening now? And then, given your experience.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I had just the opportunity at the weekend to talk to an older couple. He was actually my bishop when I was in South Africa, now in LA. And we were talking exactly about this. And in a couple of the sermons that I preached, where I've talked about this, I've had these moments when I've been was watching TV, last year in the summer in Ferguson and other times, you're watching TV and it just triggers life in South Africa back in the late 80s. And you kind of go, is that South Africa? Or is that here? And then you watch it and you wait a little bit and you watch it. Oh my gosh, that's Auckland. Oh my gosh, that's Ferguson. Oh my gosh, that's not where I thought it was. I thought they were maybe playing something from, way back in South Africa, and it's not. And that shows how similar in some ways it is, right? It's not the same, but there are just similarities of that sense of frustration and anger that people get, and then giving them the willpower and the desire, both the desire and the willpower to act collectively, to say, enough is enough. We have to do something, and then to realize we can do something. We don't just have to sit and say this is wrong. We can't do anything, which is kind of how I grew up. You can say, actually, this is wrong, and we can do something. And in this country, there's a lot that can't be done. And so that was interesting to me, sort of watching, especially the younger generation, because I'd also thought about this a lot and realized, the people who marched in the 60s in the civil rights movement here are all older.
Right.
They're all older. And some of the leaders are dying or have already died. And so there's this possibility of losing the institutional memory and losing the memories and losing the stories unless they've been written down and filmed and videoed and so on, which makes that still such an important activity. But the younger generation haven't been through that. Right. And so what it seemed like in some ways that there's time for the younger generation to discover what it is to be frustrated, what it is to realize the inequality that exists, what it is to realize that something needs to be done, and then to start to do it. And then also to realize there's different ways of doing it, and how can you be more effective rather than less effective? Let's say what is effective, what's not effective, and this is not the 1960s. This is not South Africa in the 1980s or 70s even. This is the US in 2014 and 15. So social media has changed a lot of how things happen and the way things happen, and what is there to be learned. But I think about what is there to be learned from the movements. And that seems to me that there's a lot of conversation to be had, but certainly so much similarity and emotion, and adrenaline and anger and frustration and sadness and sorrow. And how can this be? How can this be? How can this be happening in my country? I hear people saying, how can this be happening in this country? Mm-hmm. And yet it is. And so it's time for soul searching. I really like what President Obama said, I think, in the eulogy for the Charleston shootings.
That was amazing.
I've said the particular part where people said, we need to have it's time for a national conversation. And then he said, we have been having this conversation, right? So it's time for the national conversation, but in fact, the conversation has been happening. It's time also for action. And of course, continued conversation and learning and dialogue, because nothing in the end happens that's meaningful and sustaining without the dialogue that goes with it. The action can happen, but if it's not supported, by dialogue, by education, by learning, by continuing to build movements, then it's not going to be sustained.
Do you think that's the lesson of South Africa? Because, a lot of the work that was done, especially in the years where the apartheid system came mm-hmm. down, a lot of the work was action and conversation, with truth and reconciliation.
Yeah, it's so hard to talk as a South African at the moment. We are so all over the map as a country. We have all these amazing things that happened and that we did.
Right. And,
we're also famous for many things that are tragic. So it's always just really hard to speak about it. But for instance, before I came to the States, I was a university chaplain. So I worked with people, students who were 18 to 25, pretty much. And so the youngest of them was starting to be what we call the born frees. They would be the people born in 1994. And so, or afterwards, which meant they were born into independent South Africa, which meant that now the students and the young adults, they didn't know apartheid. They didn't know it. They were born after it. And so, and often some of them will say, this wasn't our struggle. Why are you telling us about this struggle? So for us who are older, it's our life. It's our life. Everything we did, whatever we worked at, it was colored by the situation, by the struggle. It's all that our lives were. Everything about our lives was tinged by it. And so we want to pass that on as well as moving into, the newness of the South Africa, and not always knowing how to without putting off the younger generation. And so the younger generation are all over the map again. I think some of them want to go back into their communities. Some of them want to be able to learn to listen to the past. Some of them are, this is not my struggle, dude. Some of them I want to just make a living and get a job. Really all over the map. But still enough, I think, young people who are exciting and gifted, who want to make a difference. That there definitely is hope for it's hopeful still.
Well, I think I see that with...
Yeah, I think is what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way. I think that means there's hope here also.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think I was just going to say something to that extent because, when I talk a lot to a lot of the younger generation here, and I've done a lot of activism around gender issues and transgender issues. And, there's a lot of like, why is this an issue?
Right.
Why, of course they're a woman, or of course, they can be queer.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Of course they're Black. Why is this an issue? And it's like, to some degree, it's kind of like, well, yeah, I guess you're right. But, this is the history, right. And we've lived that history, and it's hard. We've had to do a lot of hard work to get to the point where you are by birth.
Right. And what you have, whether it's privilege of gender-free, gender-equal society, so-called, or in some way, the privilege you have was built on the backs of those who struggled for it. And so they don't always recognize the struggle.
I mean, do you see similar things in youth regarding race? I think I've seen...
It was proximity, right? So a lot of people, their lives are different from their parents' lives. They have more opportunities. They get to study, and that was because of struggle. And when they know how their parents struggled, they're close enough to their parents' story to be able to continue to do something to make people's lives better. It's when people have moved away from that struggle and don't see the realities that still exist. Right? So then they're not in close proximity to people who are experiencing the frustration. And so that's why they say, what's the issue? So whether that's, again, in a situation of gender, maybe, I know people have experienced no struggle with gender at all. Right. And in the church, they happen by virtue of randomness. They have a woman priest, and then another woman priest, and then a lesbian woman priest, and they grew up in a neighborhood which was different races, and so they just didn't see anything else. And so they would say that they're colorblind and gender-free, so what's the issue, right? But if you were to invite them to drive 20 minutes somewhere in any direction, probably, for 20 minutes, half an hour in some direction, and start talking to the people, you would find out a completely different experience.
Right.
So for people who are not close to the experience, that doesn't make sense. So part of what I think is the challenge is how to help people who are not in close proximity to people's needs or frustrations or stories or anger, how to facilitate that so that they can hear that not everybody's happy. Not everybody's equal. Maybe everyone in your little bubble is equal. But actually, increase the size of the bubble, and that ain't so, Right. And if you look at the statistics of the country, that in itself should tell you something.
Absolutely. Although I think it's interesting how the internet both facilitates being able to look at and listen to other people's stories, and also kind of can close in sometimes, depending on how you use it.
Yes, and of course, I'm old school enough. It's face-to-face, Face-to-face is really in how we change. I might read something that's challenging on Facebook. I do all the time. but I'm not sure that's as good as or as deep as, face-to-face encounter. Like I was in my third year of university, I was on a conference, so the first conference ever for white and black students together. And I had a theology student named Lazarus who took me to task one night after the plenary session. And basically, maybe it was a little unfair, but basically it's like, you're white and that's a problem. You are complicit, basically is what he was saying. And I cried. But I had never thought I was complicit. I want to be a good person, that's who I am.
Right.
And so I couldn't see, it hit me that I was complicit just by sheer virtue of being white. And that was a very, very, very tough conversation. But it was a very necessary conversation. He could have walked away. He could have, said, oh, you're Wilma, you're white, you're South African, cheers, I'm done. He chose to take time to talk with me and challenge me. And, I chose, I didn't choose. I had the response I had. It was earth-shattering. Mm-hmm. It was horrible. I felt awful for days, but it changed me. And that was what set me on my transformation journey. That plus the love your neighbor as yourself, the black South African neighbor as yourself kind of idea in action. But without that, right, I might just be another average white South African who never had that experience. So because of someone else who took the time to talk to me, I was changed.
Yeah, I mean, I've had similar experiences, and you're right about that face to face, because I think when you're face to face with somebody and they're telling you their story of what happened to them and about where they're at, you can't really deny that, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You can't deny the person in front of you saying, "This is my experience," and right. you have this privilege just because you're born. Mm-hmm. So I need you to think about that. And it is a kind of a mind-blowing experience. But I know for me, it was the same kind of thing. It's just like, oh, I really need to think outside of myself about this.
Yeah. And
it was, and it's humbling in a lot of ways too, because, especially when, I've been doing work at ministry at City of Refuge, and being able to listen to stories and see for my own self healing in profound ways, but also being around to witness the microaggressions, to witness the racism of other people.
Right.
And just really seeing it, and around gender as well, because, my wife is transgender. So, I've seen it in that capacity as well. And it's just like, oh, now I get.
Right.
I get it.
I lived in a black township, I could never be the same after that. Never. I just understood things in a whole different way.
Why do you think people keep trying to stay blind to it? Like, because, I've known some people, it's kind of like, I tell them over and over, and I talk to them about these experiences and stuff, and it's just like, la, 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 I'm not hearing it, la, 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 don't want to know.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's about comfort zones. I was very clear when it was the middle of the year, it was our winter break, and I realized that I'd had disease epiphanies. So that's understatement, right? But I had these enormous epiphanies, and I absolutely knew that I had a choice. I was so clear with myself. I probably journaled about it. I had it, it's like, Wilma Jakobsen, you have a choice. You have a choice now. You have this knowledge. Now, what am I going to do with it? And I could either be like, I've used this often in sermons, you can either be like an ostrich, you put your head in the sand, because that's how we used to talk about, change in South Africa, that the people put their head in the sand so that you don't experience the discomfort of knowing it's not quite going that well.
Right.
Pretending it's all fine, basically, right?
Yep.
And so I had such a strong sense of choice. I could choose to do something with the knowledge I had. I could choose to put my head in the sand. But in the end, it wasn't a choice, right? For me, it felt like, oh, well, that's not a choice. That is no choice. The only choice you have is to respond and do something. But I guess it is that. You do have a choice. If you have the knowledge, it doesn't change behavior in the end. For some people, it does, right? But knowledge doesn't necessarily change behavior. Just because you know something doesn't mean you will make the change. Lots of people say, oh, I know what I have to do. But it doesn't do it. So it's something else happens at the heart level. It's not rational. It's not a head thing, right? So something else happens. It's spiritual. It's at the heart level. Something else has to make you decide I'm not going to do this anymore, or I am going to do this thing. I'm going to stop doing the bad thing, or I'm going to start doing the good thing because it's the right thing to do, or because I can't do anything else but that. So everyone's their own person, their own personality, their own journey, and so on. So I guess for some people, whatever would persuade them is not compelling enough.
Right.
Either the story hasn't touched them enough. And often it's around heart and experience, which is why, we talk about, my previous church, we used to talk about transformational journeys, because people change when they go to see something or they experience something. If they experience it, they just hear about it. So we used to put together journeys that range from going to South Africa or Hiroshima, or somewhere far, Mexico, the border, or to Skid Row in LA, or to the intern camps, and so that you could say and then hear the stories, and because that's what changes people. And truthfully, out of those trips, I took people to South Africa a few times. People change because you hear the stories, you see the stuff, and you go, oh my. So then that the interior is moved and challenged and changed. So it's about experience, and something has to be experienced.
Yeah. And I think, like I was describing before with me and having, seeing the struggle in South Africa, just even on TV for me, I mean, for me, it was a really moving experience just to see that, and it touched me on that kind of level. And then, there's been plenty of other experiences then, like, the reason I got into a lot of the work around gender and transgender is not only because of my wife, but because at one level it affected me. And I was just like, oh, no, this is not okay. You know?
That's exactly it. And then something changed you. Yeah.
Right. And then that ultimately led me into seminary and actually doing this podcast, because, for me, being able to hear those stories outside of my own comfort zone, outside of my own experience, really helped me understand more about the real struggles of just being human, but especially being human in places that I didn't know. Yeah.
And in the end, that's one of the things, the concept of that cuts across all of them, the concept of being human. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be equally human? What does it mean that all human beings are equal? All human beings have equal value. Put in theological terms, that all human beings are made in the image of God. All people have dignity, equally, right? So those are the concepts that cut across, whether it's transgender, or whether it's race, or whether it's gender, or whether it's class, or religion, or beliefs. That's that everyone is human. Yeah.
And then what does that mean? Because for some people, all people being equal is people like them, and it's hard for them to really break out of.
It's how to live with difference, the biggest challenge of the human race. How to live with our differences, how to celebrate our differences, yes.
And how to be okay with our differences and not erasing them, because there are some,
Yes. Not going to the lowest common denominator. Yes.
Right. Because there's some people who I know in spiritual community, who try to kind of mush everything together so it's all acceptable to everybody. And then you kind of lose meaning because it all kind of blurs and blends together. And then it's like,
right.
What is this
I don't think that. There's something you might be interested in. There's a friend of mine who runs a project called Pico Union in LA. It was a church that used to be a synagogue. So first of all, it was a synagogue. They grew and moved, so it became a church, and then the church declined. How areas change and so on. It's in LA, and he bought it back from the church with the proviso that the church would keep on meeting in the church. So the church continues to worship in the church, and over the past 3 years now, I think he now has the first ever Muslim women's congregation meeting there. There's a Jewish group that's starting to meet there, and they've done all sorts of interfaith kinds of stuff. Now, it's not one multi-faith place, right? It's multiple groups of faith meeting in the same building, doing all sorts of different things that are so creative and interesting. And that's what makes sense, right? So they're all different, but it's one house of God, basically. It's fascinating. So you might be interested in talking to him at some point.
Absolutely. I mean, I've kind of had a dream of doing something similar around here, because it's like, when instead of thinking about the differences, we do have a lot of similarities, and that, even of ritual and that, and common purpose, there's a lot of like helping the poor and being compassionate. And so it's like, to me, it makes sense having a lot of religions under one roof, especially in this day and age when, there's a lot of decline in, single entity churches, and which makes it harder for, to maintain a big building.
The interreligious movement in South Africa was at its strongest during the worst part of apartheid, because we had to band together. And then it sort of waned a bit, quite out of exhaustion in the early 90s. But then it sort of got together again to look at, South Africa was becoming very violent. And so the interreligious community came together again to say, what can we do to decrease the violence in our society? So when you can find an issue around which that you feel similarly, whether it's peace building or, whether it's decreasing violence or social justice, there's the way that when you work together, you discover that it doesn't matter as much that your worship is different. If you can work together to, help the human race become a human family kind of thing.
Exactly. So speaking of other social justice things, I read recently that the Episcopal Church, U.S. Episcopal Church, has fully sanctioned same-sex marriage.
Yes,
awesome.
I wasn't officially there, but I went for 2 days. It was an 8-day long thing in Salt Lake City. And I actually was sitting in the House of Bishops at the point when they passed the 2 resolutions that meant that the 2 big changes, basically. And it's been coming for years. And one of the moving things I did, I attended a service for Integrity, which is the name of the organization that has worked towards this in the Episcopal Church for the last 40 years. And so they told the story of the guy who founded it, called Louis Crew Clay. And I hadn't actually realized that they'd been working towards this for 40 years. That's a long time. Wow. So in a sense, what I saw and what we all experienced then at convention was the fruit of 40 long, hard years of hard work, which was amazing. And so the bishops were discussing 2 things. The one was the canon, that's church rule, the canon on same-sex marriage, which before that referred to marriage as being between a man and a woman. And then they were also then looking at giving their blessing to using particular rites, the liturgies, the services themselves, the words you use for the marriage. And so, and yes, just to show how things have shifted, I think it was 129 votes in favor, about 26 against, and maybe 20 abstentions, which is a solid vote. That's a solid vote. And then I think there were 20 bishops who signed a dissenting dissenting minority report. But of those, at least a good few were retired bishops, because retired bishops in the Episcopal Church still get to be present and have a vote. Go figure. I'll just say that because I'm South African. Which is kind of odd. Right. But so that sort of again shows part of it. But it was interesting. They worked really hard at not alienating people, and I think it was hard but good. So that beforehand they said when the result is announced, and they did it by roll call. Every bishop had to say yes, no, abstain.
Oh wow!
Right. So it takes quite a long time. And then they announced the results, and they said, please, nobody is to make a sound. So nobody was to cheer, nobody was to be cross, nobody was to be upset, basically. So it was silent. It was a very quiet kind of thing. It was interesting being sitting there and sort of saying this monumental thing is happening right now, and it's completely quiet. Mm-hmm. But then it isn't the last stage. From there, it goes then to the House of Deputies, which it did 3 days later, actually, on Wednesday. And then it passed there also magnificently. So yeah, monumental times, absolutely monumental times.
Oh, I think it's fantastic. I was like, oh my God, this is so cool.
10 years ago, people would not have thought. The Supreme Court decision came just very well timed, right? It came just the second day of the convention. So that was incredible timing. But some of my colleagues and friends, clergy friends, are saying, 10 years ago, because I was then in Pasadena in LA, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have thought about this. We wouldn't even have dreamed this. And it's like me and apartheid. You kind of think, oh, maybe this will change in my lifetime, maybe, hopefully. And then suddenly it happens a lot faster than you think. Mm-hmm. And same thing, I think, well, maybe this will change. And yes, this has changed. And wow, maybe this can change as you look at the last couple of years. You kind of think, wow, we've come further than we thought.
Oh, yeah.
And then suddenly, wow, we've got to this place that we weren't sure we would get to. So that's definitely to be celebrated. And then also, and for me, coming from outside of the States, realizing how hard it is culturally for people from other cultures where this is just not the culture, and where even talking about sex or sexuality is taboo, you just don't do it. It's trying to figure out how do we respect each other's differences while absolutely celebrating this particular move, and knowing this has made it difficult for others in other countries, for say like Uganda, where your life is threatened if you happen to be gay or lesbian or transgender or bi or anything. That's a whole different thing. It's not about just taking a vote.
Right.
It's about life or death. And so you realize this is big stuff. Mm-hmm. And so we don't do this lightly, and you celebrate and try and kind of hold it together in some kind of tension, I guess.
Well, it's kind of, it's what I like to tell people is, one of the revelations epiphanies, I should say, that I had a while ago, is that one of my wise mentors said, there's always, the margins always have margins, and that, you have to meet people where they're at.
Yes.
And, you can't force anybody to think exactly like you, even if you are really determined that you are right.
Yeah.
But, and you have, and I know from my own work that I have to remember that, like, I'm nobody will change overnight, especially if it's stuff that they've learned from a little child, and I ran into that a lot doing my interfaith work, and we've had things going on with that where it's like, people are just don't understand how I can combine Wicca and Christianity.
Right.
And, it's like, what is this? And, and I realized, the norms of what they believe they've learned from a young age. And I can't change that in a second. I can change it over time.
Mm-hmm. And through relationship.
Yeah, and through relationship.
But it's fear of the unknown. Hey? I mean, I think people are so afraid of what is not known. And it's this misunderstanding. There's so much that we don't know. And that's okay. We need to be open to learning from others who are different from us. Yeah.
And and I think you're right. It's relationship that really breaks down those walls. And it's like, oh, hey, wait, this is a person. They bring their kids to school. They go to, they make dinner for their partner. That kind of stuff.
Yep, exactly.
So, thank you, Wilma, for an amazing conversation, and thank you for indulging me about talking about your history.
Oh, it's fun. I don't get to do it too often. So it's like, oh, okay, I can indulge in it too.
Awesome. So if people wanted to get in touch with you to ask questions or to talk to you about stuff that we raised in this episode, what is the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Probably email. It's very easy email. So it's my name, Wilma, and you spell out St. Jude's, SAINTJUDES.org. Or you can just go to our website, so www.stjudes.org, but you spell out the saint. I'm excited about some things that we're doing at St. Jude's, so I kind of hope people go to the website.
Sure. Well, I'll have links to your email and to St. Jude's in the show notes, and you'll make sure that that's all in there. So thank you so much. This has been really great.
Great. Well, thank you, Gina. Thanks a lot. Bye.
I'd like to thank Wilma for joining us on this episode. As always, if you have comments, questions, or would like to read the show notes, you can go to thisweekinheresy.com. You can subscribe to the show via iTunes or the Stitcher app, or follow us on Twitter at TWIH Podcast. You can also financially support this podcast through PayPal or Patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.